9 places told them no. 9 gas stations and houses and front porches where somebody looked out through the glass. Saw 2 women standing in the middle of a West Texas dust storm with a dead truck behind them and 45-mile-an-hour winds pulling at their clothes. It made the calculation that whatever was inside was worth more than whatever was out there needing help. 9 times. Rosa told me later that after the 7th, she had stopped expecting it to go any other way. She said it quietly, without self-pity, the way you describe weather. Valentina didn't say anything. She was the kind of person who stored things up, rather than said them out loud, and this was one of those things. I was number 10. The last building on the south edge of Alpine, Texas, where the town gives way to pale scrub and caliche flats, and eventually, if you keep driving, to the Chihuahuan Desert and the long rust-colored silence of Big Bend country. Alpine has about 6,000 people and a state university, and a main street with good coffee and a restaurant that makes the best green chili enchiladas in the entire Trans-Pecos region. It also has, on its south edge, it's an old stone building that used to be a feed store in the 1940s and is now where I live and work. On a particular Friday afternoon in October, I was pressing a border pattern into the skirt of a custom saddle when the norther hit. In West Texas, a norther is not a suggestion. It is a cold front that arrives from the north at highway speed, drops the temperature 30 degrees in 2 hours, picks up every particle of desert dust and arranges it into a brown wall you can see coming from 20 miles away and cannot do anything about once it arrives. The sky goes the color of old dishwater. The wind hits you like something that has strong opinions. The dust gets into every gap and window seal, and you taste it for hours after. I had battened everything down at 3 in the afternoon when I saw it on the horizon. By 4:30, the town outside my windows had disappeared behind a curtain of brown. I was inside with the door latched, the radio on, and the swivel knife in my hand when the knock came. Not at the front door. At the side door, the one most people don't know about. 2 knocks firm. The kind that says the person doing it is not sure the door can hear them over the wind. I set down the knife. Opened the side door to women. The taller one was turned sideways against the wind, her arm raised to block the dust. She was wearing a denim jacket that was doing its best and losing. The shorter one had a bandana pulled over her nose and mouth and was holding her hair with both hands and still squinting against the grit in the air. Between them, through the brown haze, a truck with its hazard lights blinking at the edge of the road. The shorter one pulled the bandana down and said, "Fast and clear. Our truck battery died. Everything's closed or nobody's answering. We've been to 9 places. Can we come in until the storm passes?" The taller one added, "We just need to wait it out. We won't be any trouble." I held the door open and stepped back. 9 places. My building was number 10. Their names were Rosa and Valentina Castillo. Rosa was 24, a muralist and street artist from El Paso, the kind of artist who worked big. On the sides of buildings and water towers and underpasses, the surfaces that most people look at without seeing. She had paint stained under her nails that didn't come from this trip and probably never fully came out. And she talked the way she worked, freely and without excessive concern for what anyone else thought of it. Valentina was 29, a high school art teacher in San Antonio, quieter and more watchful, and carrying the specific kind of careful that people develop when they spend years loving someone who is fearless. They had been driving from El Paso to San Antonio, cutting through Alpine because Rosa had wanted to see the landscapes around Marfa, and Valentina had agreed because the drive-through, the Davis Mountains, was worth it regardless of anything else they had not planned on the norther. I made coffee. I had no plan to do anything beyond that. The coffee led to finding the leftover flour tortillas and the can of refried beans I had meant to have for lunch. And the beans led naturally to the hot sauce situation already on the counter. And somehow, 30 minutes after they knocked, I was heating beans and cutting Monterey Jack and folding tortillas in a dry skillet, and there was a real meal happening. At the cleared work table, Valentina sat with her shoulders squared, the posture of someone who has been taking care of herself and someone else for a long time and is not entirely sure it is safe to stop. She drank the coffee and ate the food and watched, She watched me navigate the workshop with the ease of someone who knows where every tool lives without looking. She watched me not ask them any questions, not where they were coming from or where they were going or what exactly had brought them. Through Alpine on an October Friday with a storm bearing down, I figured if they wanted me to know, they would tell me. My grandfather raised me to believe that the most respectful thing you can offer someone is room to be private. Something in Valentina shifted, degree by degree. The set of her jaw loosened slightly. Her shoulders went from squared to resting. Small differences. But I noticed after we ate, Rosa drifted back to the saddle on its stand. She stood in front of it with her arms crossed and her head tilted, looking at the acanthus leaf border the way she looked at murals she admired. Not quickly, but with patience, letting her eye follow each line and understand the decisions behind it. She asked how long a border section like that took. I told her about 2.5 hours for that length. If the leather was cooperating and the temperature in the shop was right, she said, 2.5 hours for 8 inches. I said yes. She said, I once spent 3 weeks on a 20-foot mural in El Paso, and people walk past it in 6 seconds without looking up. I told her, the right people stop. She was quiet for a moment after that, still looking at the acanthus leaves. Valentina, on the far side of the room, watched her sister with the expression of someone who recognizes a particular look and knows what it means. Rosa was across the room before the food was even on the table. She moved through the studio the way she would move along a wall she was about to paint. With real attention and real curiosity, touching nothing but seeing everything. She looked at the saddle on the stand with its half-finished acanthus leaf border. She looked at the tools laid out on the bench in the order I used them, at the patterns pinned to the pegboard, at the photographs on the wall, my grandfather at his bench in 1988, 20 years younger, his hands around a piece of leather, wearing the same expression I probably wear when something is going right, and then she looked at the old leather skiver in the far corner of the bench. It was an old tool. Heavy steel blade worn smooth from use. The handle built up from layers of pressed and lacquered leather that had gone a deep, warm brown. On the flat side of the handle, pressed in with a branding iron, 2 letters. Below them a small longhorn. FD. She picked it up, turned it slowly. Read the markings. Set it back with care. Cool tool, she said. What's FD? Maker's mark, I said. It was my grandfather's. Said it was just the initials of whoever made the tool originally. He never explained more than that. She nodded. Her eyes stayed on it one more second. Then she moved on to the saddle. There was a half-finished piece of work on the stand, and that was more interesting right now. She turned to me. Can I touch it? The tooling. Go ahead. She ran her fingertips along the acanthus leaf border, the way she would touch a mural she was studying. Not to take credit, just to understand the decisions that had been made. She felt the depth of the cuts, the angle of the beveling where the wood swivel tool had gone deep and where it had feathered back. What pattern is this? She asked. Acanthus leaf. Old Texas pattern. My grandfather used it on almost everything he made. Did he teach you all of it? Every single thing I know, I said. She looked at me. Her expression was the kind that belongs to people who ask questions because they actually want to know the answer. Not because they are being polite. Tell me about him. I don't usually tell people about my grandfather. He is not someone who translates well into general terms. He was too specific. But there was something about the way Rosa asked, like she was making room for the real answer rather than the brief one. And that made the difference. I told her about Alejandro Reyes, who everyone called Abuelo. He had come to Alpine, or somewhere near it. He was always a little vague about exactly where. And learned leatherwork from an old vaquero when he was 12 years old and never once looked back. He raised me after my parents died when I was 5, without making a ceremony of it. I just moved into his building and became part of his work and his days. He could look at a raw piece of leather and tell you within a minute what it wanted to be. He talked about the material the way some people talk about living things, like it had a memory. Like it knew the difference between a careful hand and an impatient one. He had a saying that I heard so often it became the background rhythm of my whole childhood. He said it when I was rushing a cut, when I was fighting the leather instead of following it. I was trying to impose a shape instead of finding the one already inside. The leather tells you where it wants to fold. Listen before you cut. He said it the way someone says something they know to be true at the cellular level with no need to explain. He died when I was 19. He left me the building, the tools, the bench, the patterns, and that one sentence pinned above the workbench on a card in his handwriting. Slow down. The leather is not going anywhere. Rosa was quiet after I finished. Then she said, he sounds like someone who understood that craft is just another word for paying attention. That was more precisely true than anything I had ever said about him myself. Valentina made the second pot of coffee without asking, because she had located the beans and the machine was self-explanatory. She brought it to the work table and sat across from Rosa. And from me, and the three of us talked for a long while about art and making things and the difference between speed and care. Valentina said she spent most of her school days trying to teach teenagers that making something bad first was a necessary part of making something good, and that the refusal to make bad things was the main obstacle between most people and the ability to make excellent ones. I told her that was exactly what my grandfather had taught me. Just with more leather and fewer teenagers, she actually laughed. A small, real laugh. I got the impression it was not something she gave away carelessly. Rosa had come back to the table by now. She was listening with her chin in one hand, drawing small shapes on the back of a scrap paper with her other. Absent-minded and automatic the way artists do when their hands need to keep moving even when the rest of them is paying attention to something else. She said, Abuelo sounds like the kind of person who would have been a terrible employee. I thought about it. He would have been an outstanding employee, I said. He just never would have worked for anyone else. Rosa pointed at me. That. Exactly that. Valentina looked at her sister and then at me and said quietly, she's describing herself. Rosa did not deny it. She just added another small shape to the paper and kept listening. The norther blew itself out by late afternoon. The dust settled. The sky went from dishwater to a cold, clean blue, the kind that the Transpackles produces after a storm like an apology. The temperature had dropped to the low 40s. Rosa texted for a tow and got a call back saying morning was the earliest. Too many calls from the storm. I had a storage room with a daybed frame and a real mattress. The problem was there was only one of it, and it was a twin. One bed, I said, showing them the room. It's a twin. Not very wide. Valentina looked at it. How wide? About 32 inches. She looked at Rosa. Rosa said, we shared a full-size mattress on our grandmother's floor every Christmas until I was 15. We'll be fine. Di went back to the studio. I had a cot for late nights, and with the space heater running and a good wool blanket, the temperature was tolerable. I laid the cot next to the workbench and the saddle on its stand and slept better than I expected. With the smell of leather and neatsfoot oil and the norther finally dying outside, morning came, clear and perfectly still. West Texas, after a norther, is its own thing, crystalline and huge and so quiet you can hear a hawk a quarter-mile away. I made eggs and more tortillas and the last of the cheese and salsa from a jar. We ate at the work table. The three of us talked like people who have spent a night in the same building talk. With fewer barriers than the first conversation, Rosa came back to the studio after breakfast with her sketchbook. She sat on the stool at the far end of the bench and watched me work. After about 10 minutes, she started drawing. I glanced over once. She was sketching the saddle on the stand. Not a technical drawing, more of an impression. The light on the tooling, the shadow in the curve of the seat, the way the whole thing floated in space on the stand. After a while, she set the sketchbook down. Can I draw your hands? Nobody's asked me that before, I said. I should have. You do interesting things with them.
Ow.
I held them out, palms up. She looked at them for a moment before picking up the pencil, the same way she had studied the tooling before she touched it. The stain from the leather dye that does not fully wash out. The calluses from the swivel knife. The small scar on the right index finger from a skiving accident years ago. She drew carefully and in silence, her eyes moving between my hands and the page. Seeing something there that I could not see looking down at my own palms, she drew for longer than I expected. At one point, she asked me to close my hands slightly, the way they would close around the swivel knife handle when I was actually working, but without the knife in them. Then she asked me to open them fully again, palms up. She drew both positions, one on each page. She said the difference between the two was what interested her most. Working hands and still hands are completely different shapes, she said, and most people only draw the still ones because they are easier. But the working ones are where the story is. We were sitting like that, Rosa drawing and me thinking about what she had said, when we heard the engine, a Suburban, black, coming up the south road at a pace that said the driver knew exactly where they were going and intended to arrive. It stopped in front of the building and a man got out. 60, maybe 58, built solidly, the kind of man who had been physically strong once and had settled into something harder and more dense. Gray hair, a pressed shirt under an open jacket. The posture of someone perpetually in the middle of a meeting, even when he was standing in a parking lot in the Texas desert. Rosa's pencil stopped. Valentina, who had come to the studio doorway, went very still. The man knocked at the side door. I opened it. Frank Drayton, he said. I'm here for my daughters. He stepped in. He looked at the studio with the quick, cataloging attention of someone who assesses situations for a living. The saddle on the stand, the tools on the bench, the smell of leather and oil, me. He looked at Valentina. Then Rosa. He looked at the work table. And then he looked at the old leather skiver at the corner of the bench. He walked to it, picked it up, turned it in his hands slowly. His thumb found the pressed markings on the handle, FD and the longhorn, and stayed there. He stood very still, long enough that the room began to feel the weight of it. He said quietly, Where did you get this? My grandfather's, I said. He left it to me when he died. What was your grandfather's name? Alejandro Reyes. Everyone called him Abuelo. Frank Drayton set the tool back on the bench and sat down on the stool. In his pressed shirt in a leather workshop in Alpine, Texas. He sat there, looking at the tool for a moment. He did not look at his daughters. He did not look at me. He looked at the skiver the way you look at something you had filed away as gone and were not prepared to see. Again, sitting on a workbench in the Chihuahuan Desert, FD, he said. Felipe Drayton. He left in 1971. We never knew where he went, before I tell you what that meant. Before I tell you the whole story of who my grandfather actually was and what he had walked away from and why he had never explained the markings on that old tool handle, I need you to do one thing. Drop the word leather in the comments right now. Just that one word. I want to know how many of you are still here. Drop it, and I will keep going. Felipe Drayton was Frank's father's younger brother. Born in Midland, Texas in 1938, into the family that would build Drayton Energy into one of the larger private oil and gas operations in the Permian Basin. The Draytons had ranching money first, then oil. And by the time Felipe was a young man, the expectation was simply that every Drayton would contribute to what already existed. Felipe was the youngest son. He was also the one who sat through every business meeting like a man in a room, where he could not breathe. What he could do was make things with his hands. Leatherwork, specifically. He had learned it from an old vaquero who worked the family's ranch. And he had a gift for it that people recognized even when they thought leatherwork was something ranch employees did. Not something a Drayton should aspire to build a life around. He wanted to open a shop. He wanted to make saddles from morning until dark, and he wanted every piece to be something that outlasted him. The family said no. The family said they had not built what they built for one of their own, to go make saddles in some small town. Felipe left anyway. He drove west in 1971. With his tools and his savings and whatever was in a bag on the seat beside him, he stopped in Alpine because his truck needed water pump work. While he was waiting at the garage, he met a woman named Esperanza Reyes, a school teacher, who told him flat out that the water pump would take 2 days and there was no hotel. But her mother had a spare room if he needed it. 2 months later, he was still in Alpine. He married Esperanza in 1972, took her family's name, because he said the Drayton name belonged to a life he was not living anymore. There was no sense carrying it. He opened a leather workshop in an old feed store on the south edge of town that he fixed up himself with Esperanza's brothers. He became, over the following decades, one of the most respected saddle makers in West Texas, known particularly for the acanthus leaf border that he used on almost every piece he made. He never told his family where he had gone. He sent one letter in 1973, saying he was well and that he hoped they could someday understand. No return address. The family looked for a while. They did not find him. The name Felipe Drayton became one that was mentioned carefully at family gatherings. Mentioned at all. Frank sat on the stool in my grandfather's studio for a long time after. He looked at the tools, the patterns pinned to the pegboard, the photographs on the wall. He looked at the saddle on the stand bearing the acanthus border his uncle had made famous in this part of Texas. He looked at his daughters. Valentina spoke first. She said it clearly and without anger. "You have been tracking our phones and showing up because you are afraid we will disappear the way Felipe did. Every time you tighten your grip to keep us from leaving, it is the exact thing that makes us need to go." Frank looked at his daughter. Something moved across his face. Not quite surrender. Not quite relief. The expression of a man who has been carrying a story about control and protection and has just heard someone name what it actually is. He said, "I know," Rosa said more gently. "Dad, he didn't disappear. He came here. He built something real, and he was happy. That's not disappearing. That's arriving somewhere." Frank looked at the old skiver on the bench. His uncle's tool. The thing that had sat on this bench for 50 years and ended up in my apron pocket every time I walked out the door. He said, "I'm at the Antelope Lodge through Sunday." He looked at Rosa, then Valentina. "I am not going to make arrangements. I am not going to tell you what to do. If you want dinner and to talk, call me." To pause. That's all. He walked out. The Suburban left in a cloud of caliche dust. The wind was already beginning to scatter. The studio was quiet for a long time. All three of us just let it be quiet. Valentina was looking at the old skiver on the bench. Rosa was looking at her sketchbook. I was looking at nothing in particular, which is what you do when something large has just been said in a room and you need a moment before the next thing. After a while, I got up and poured 3 cups of coffee that none of us had asked for and put them on the table without comment, because it was the only useful thing I could think of to do. Valentina took hers and held it in both hands and looked at the skiver and said quietly, "He was happy. That's the part my father's going to have to live with. That Felipe left everything the family built and he was happy," Rosa said. "Maybe that's the part that can help him." Valentina was quiet. Then she looked at her sister and smiled a small, real smile. Then she said, "I have to get back. I have students Monday, and there are things in my classroom that I have been putting off long enough. And I realize I have been running away from San Antonio when everything I actually want is already there." She looked at me. "Marco, what your grandfather built here is worth building. I mean that." She shouldered her bag and walked out to wait for the morning tow. Rosa was still in the studio. She was standing at the south-facing window, looking out at the desert. The transpacal sky after a norther has a blue that does not exist anywhere else, crystalline and enormous and so clear it almost hurts. The mountains to the south were sharp and close-looking. "The way they get when the air has been scrubbed clean," she said. "There's an arts organization on 5th Street. I saw their sign when we were walking yesterday. They have a mural commission posted. Community center. Big south-facing wall, maybe 60 feet across." "I know that wall," I said. "It's been blank since I can remember." "That's a lot of blank to fill," she said. She picked up the old skiver from the bench one more time. "Read the initials." Looked at the Longhorn brand. "Set it back." He listened before he cut, she said. "Not to me exactly. More to the tools and the leather and the photographs and everything my grandfather had built here and left for me to carry forward." She picked up her sketchbook and tucked it under her arm and looked at me with the expression of someone who has made a decision and is completely at peace with its weight. "Going to go talk to that arts organization," she said. "Today, while the sky is still this color." She walked out into the Alpine afternoon. I watched through the south window as she crossed the pale caliche lot and headed north toward town, her sketchbook under her arm, her shadow long and clear behind her in the October light. I stood at the bench for a while. Just stood. The studio was quiet in the specific way it gets when work is the only thing left in it. I looked at the skiver on the bench corner. Felipe Drayton. Alejandro Reyes. A man who had carried 2 names in one set of hands, and who had decided that the hands were the part worth keeping. 50 years of work in this building, in the smell of leather and neatsfoot oil and old wood, and at the end of it, he had left me the tools and the bench and the sentence about listening before you cut, and the acanthus leaf border pattern that was now on a saddle that someone in Presidio was going to ride across West Texas. That was not disappearing. That was staying. I picked up the swivel knife and found the place in the border where I had left off. Then I picked up the swivel knife, found the place in the acanthus leaf border where I had left off, put the tip of the blade to the leather, and felt the grain beneath my fingers. The way it was willing to give in some places and not others. The way it had its own logic that you learn by listening. The leather tells you where it wants to fold. Listen before you cut. I listened. Found the line. Made the cut. Exactly right. Outside, Alpine was still and cold, and that impossible Trans-Pecos blew. Somewhere in town, a muralist with paint already under her nails was standing in front of a 60-foot blank wall and figuring out what it wanted to become. Some doors only open once. My grandfather walked through his in 1971 with a bag of tools and a name. He was ready to leave behind. I had just watched 2 more people find theirs.